And Lasse Rungholm from OPMAS is now going to give a guide to operators. Actually, it's not completely different, is it, on how to avoid breaking the law when you go to Europe?
It's more or less the same, I guess. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. Can I get my presentation up and running? Thank you. Why is it so difficult to fly to the EU? Well, I'll get on with that. Short introduction. My name is Lasse Rungholm, which is kind of difficult for most people to say. I'm an attorney, law. I'm also a commercial pilot, EASA and FAA ATPL, and also have a Maldivian ATP because I flew seaplanes in the Maldives, which was kind of interesting. Those are my favorite airplanes for those who are aviation buffs: DC-3, the L-29, TR, Cessna 551, and the de Havilland Twin Otter. I went to law school in Denmark and did 6 months in the University of Oslo, studying primarily maritime law and specialized in that. In 2009, I decided to take a sabbatical, and I decided to go fly the DC-3, which is a classic. So I went to Atlanta, took a type rating, went to the Caribbean, and knocked on the door on 4-star air cargo. Fortunately, they were going out of business, and I needed a green card, so that didn't fly. I went to the US Virgin Islands, which, unknown to most people, actually used to be Danish territory. So we call it the Danish West India. And that's on the bucket list for every Dane. So we went there, and there we saw the seaplanes. So I became interested in seaplane flying. I have this small jet, which is fun, and I went to fly the P-51, which is another classic and a bucket list for most pilots. Very famous fighter, Chuck Yeager, Bob Hoover, those guys. Back to the Maldives. This is paradise on earth. I know a few of you are going there. If you haven't been there, please do. It's very, very expensive, but it's very, very luxurious and very nice. I had 3 days there. I came back. I flew as a captain on this ATR. My brother runs the airline, and I also fly this little Cessna for him, taking spare parts and crew back and forth between destinations. It's a lot of fun. And then I decided to go into a little business on the side. We run this corporate shuttle. It's on an AOC, by the way. It's no legal charter here. Between Aarhus and Copenhagen, and we fly 10 times a day, and it's full all the time because we cut a 2.5-hour trip down to 42 minutes on average. Just a short introduction. Before we move on to the subject and my many, many slides, which I will hurry up because I know we're behind, just a short video to introduce you to this topic. And autoplay. Can you push a button or something?
Gander, good evening, November 230 Papa Mike.
Flying to Europe? The EU is a unique economic and political partnership presently between 28 European countries that cover much of the continent: France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and so on. And then there's the UK.
Goodness gracious, what a terrible mess. It simply won't work any longer.
The single or internal market is the EU's main economic engine, enabling most goods, services, money, and people to move around freely. In relation to flying a non-EU registered aircraft in the EU, you can look at the EU as a single country, with some exceptions. Inside the EU, most major laws are supposed to be the same, but in some cases they are not, which can be rather confusing at times. Anyways, that is the EU simplified. Flying a non-EU registered aircraft inside the EU is subject to customs control and may be subjected to the value-added tax called VAT and the customs duty. So how do we deal with it? Well, in some cases it's perfectly possible to fly in the EU without any formalities. This is called a temporary admission. The guidelines differ a bit from country to country, but in general this is the situation. You can always fly straight into and out of the EU without any problems. If you want to fly inside the EU point to point, that comes with some restrictions. Point-to-point flying under the temporary admission regulation is generally possible only if you're using an aircraft privately. If you carry EU resident passengers, some member states might consider this cabotage. Also, some member states will treat corporate flying as commercial flying. So, carrying EU passengers and using a corporate jet inside the EU point-to-point may be restricted. Before 2016, it was possible to import an aircraft just like European companies do it. This is now only possible if the aircraft is imported by the real economic owner, and like before, used for correct economic activities and with any non-business use correctly handled for minimum 5 years continuously. The use of imputed income or the U.S. CFL system will not solve the compensation problem for non-business flights. Okay, we have now broadly established the restrictions, so how do we work around those problems? In a perfect world, the rules would be the same all over the EU. Well, actually, they more or less are, but they're still applied differently in some member states when it comes to carrying EU residents on board an aircraft between private and commercial usage. To eliminate all uncertainty when flying in the EU, we recommend using TA, temporary admission, backed by local customs approval, the so-called Secure Temporary Admission Procedure. Most operators will have the same flying privileges as given under full importation, as the few limitations does not influence the typical flight. By using the Secure Temporary Admission Procedure instead of full importation, operators avoid a lot of potential risk and liability. We can help you.
Gander, good evening, November 230 Papa.
So why is it so complicated? Well, it's because the EU is very, very complex. There's 28 different member states all trying to agree on stuff, and most of the times they do not. There's 24 official languages involved, so it's not like French or German or English prevails. All of the official languages have the same validity when it comes to discussing this, and that's a major, major discussion point.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
See, it's very important that we speak the same language and we understand the words correctly. There's a very famous case called the Finnish case, the AOY. It was all about whether an aircraft was delivered to an airline legally or it was used by an airline. You see, the chain of people or entities involved makes it really very different, whether it's delivered to an airline, you have a place of legal supply, or whether it's just used by an airline and owned by somebody else. In the end, the term used by an airline won, which meant that these guys could import the jet into Finland without paying the value-added tax. But had it been the other phrase that had won, they would have paid and not been able to recover it since it was a private jet. Anyway, a lot of my slides have at the bottom some links and stuff. We will distribute these via Alistair and CJI, and then you can have a look at it, because some of it I'll have to skip, otherwise we'll be here till late evening. It's very, very bureaucratic in the EU. I mean, trying to get these guys to agree takes a lot of interpreters. I think that's the major part of the employees working for the EU are translators, live translators and people working. All the regulation comes out in 24 languages. It's very, very complex. And, just to get these people in line, I mean, you see the UK, they still wear the wigs when they go to court. The French, they're still mad about the Zero Meridian not being in Paris. The French, well, they're just about getting rid of Berlusconi, but he was a character. And the Greek, well, this picture tells it all. It's falling apart. They're trying to repair it. They even have another alphabet. And we're all trying to agree on the same rules. It's very complex. It's an unruly class. And now with the Brexit, we have no idea what's really going to happen. Anyway, some of you may have imported your jets or helped your operators or owners to import a jet. That's not so good anymore. One thing that's good is that the end use, which is taking care of the duty, disappeared for all aircraft by January 1st. So that's no longer an issue. If they have an airworthy jet, that can be imported without any duty because of the end use. You don't have to apply for an end use exemption anymore. The bad thing is that a lessee import is no longer possible. Only the real owner can import an airplane. And you cannot construct it by, just filing a piece of paper and saying, well, they do now own the airplane for 5 minutes and then import it and hand it back. That doesn't work, of course. So it has to be for real. The register of real ultimate owners are becoming an EU-wide requirement. And as we're talking about the subject, partial private use, we're talking about illegal charters, but we're also talking about partial private use when you have really declared this aircraft to be a corporate airplane. That is not allowed. I don't know if you remember the Paradise Papers. There was a nice picture of Louis Hamilton and his red jet, and there was a piece of paper documented from the Isle of Man authorities that this aircraft was declared for 15% private use, despite the company owning the jet having reclaimed all of the VAT. That is, of course, not possible. You cannot do that. It's either or. So if you're fully importing it as a business in order to not pay the VAT or to reclaim all of it, you have to make sure that the aircraft is used for corporate use. It's a little bit like the charter discussion we had just before. There's a brochure on your table. It's very, very boring if you have a hard time falling asleep, jet lag, flying west to east. That's good medicine, or like almost like melatonin. But it's full of valuable information, of course. Use it as a reference, and there's these tables are in there. You can have a look at that. It basically explains in detail what you can do and what you cannot do and what are the pitfalls. I'm not going to go into that right now. So in other words, aircraft registered inside the EU customs territory, they can do a full import, but it has to be for real. Aircraft registered outside the EU customs territory, they can do temporary admission. They are only the two. You cannot do nothing. We have had operators saying, no, I'm not going to do either that or that, we're just going to fly. Well, if you're just flying into the EU, then you are actually temporarily admitting your airplane under that regime, and you have to meet the requirements. That's what Singapore Airlines, Cathay Pacific, Emirates, everybody that flies into the EU every day, they're temporarily admitting their airplane even if they're not doing anything. So you got to know what you can do and what you cannot do. So temporary admission, it was based on the Unified Customs Code. It's a new regulation that came out. It was revised. It took a very, very long time. There's a delegated act which explains in detail what you can and what you cannot do. Don't ever open this document and print it and leave the printer alone, because it's going to go on fire. It's more than 1,000 pages in there. It's very, very complex. In short, the Isle of Man, the Guernsey and the Jersey, the Channel Islands, they are not good for temporary admission. It's very clear in the customs regulations that if you're registered inside the EU customs territory, and I'm not talking about the owner, I'm talking about the airplane, simple registration with an MREG, you cannot benefit from the temporary admission regime. If you have an MREG airplane, you can only fly in the EU if it's fully imported. That means you cannot even have a single flight in or out. If you fly into London and you're MREG, if you're not fully imported, now you're smuggling your airplane. Go into Le Bourget and Nice, take your chances. It's getting more and more critical because these authorities are becoming more and more aware of it. That's the downfall or the outcome of the Paradise Papers, that they smell money. And these what should we call it, socially inclined or left-wing countries, as we are in Europe, they really don't like the corporate jet guys. It's kind of like, it's too smart, and it must be benefiting off the poor guy. So anyway, they're smelling money, so you really, really have to be careful. A long time ago, IBAC, International Business Aviation Council, and NBAA sat together, worked with the EU Commission on doing a working paper. It came out some years ago. I believe we still have it available on our website. Otherwise, it can be found on the NBAA website. They did a working paper, and they were asking a lot of questions to the EU Commission in order to clarify this. And there was a lot of clarification, but it also raised a number of other questions. Like, for example, the EU Commission was asked, if there's a charter jet coming out of the Middle East, flies to Paris, then goes to Milan, and then goes back out, is that considered commercial? And the EU Commission said, no, that's not commercial. I mean, any lawyer in here would say, no, of course that's a commercial flight. They have a charter certificate, 135 in the US or AOC or whatever. It's a charter flight. Of course it's commercial. But they said no, because there's no ticket sales. So it also created a lot of doubt. The only limitation to the temporary admission is you cannot base your airplane in the EU and you cannot stay for more than 6 months at a time. So, to recap, options for non-EU operators. Temporary admission, you don't have to do anything if you fly straight in and out. You go from here to London and go straight back, not a problem. You don't need any advice, you don't need us, you don't need any of our colleagues. You can just do this. If you want to roam around inside the EU, we advise to do something. You either fully import your airplane if you meet those requirements, or you do a temporary admission. And we offer a procedure called the secure temporary admission. Since this is not a sales presentation, I will not go into the details. I will have to touch it though, because it does really take care of the issues. Regarding temporary admission, there's a lot of myth and facts to be discussed. Persons on board, are EU residents, PAX or crew allowed? And now we're talking about EU residents. That's sometimes confused with having an EU passport. We all know, there's a lot of expats here, that you could live in China with a British passport, but you're resident of China, or resident of Hong Kong, but you're not a citizen. And that's really confusing. A lot of the inspectors on the ground, when they're doing a ramp check, they will come on board the airplane and ask for passports. And if they see an EU passport, then they will automatically ask for customs papers. And you know, it doesn't really have any bearing on the import or not, whether there's a passport on board. It depends on where the guy is resident. So I can only advise, if you have EU citizens, that they have the residency card on board as well. So the PAX, the crew, can they be flown? Can the aircraft be used for Part 91 or 135 without any problems? Yes, they can, under certain circumstances. Does the owner have to be on board EU flights? No, he does not. But, and then the most important thing, which entity is the declarant? Who's actually using the aircraft? 3 weeks ago, we got a request from a guy. It was not a customer of ours. He hasn't done anything. He was just flying. And it was an aircraft that was owned by a company on an island in the Mediterranean. There was an EU citizen on board, a friend of the Russian owner, and they hadn't done anything. When the inspector at Le Bourget came up to the guys, the pilots fled. So they were asking the guy in the back, and he says, well, I'm using the airplane. I know the owner. And of course, since it was owned by an EU entity, it was on Caribbean registration of some sort. They were not allowed to use the temporary admission, but they hadn't done anything. Customs impounded it. They had to pay the VAT, they had to pay the duty, and they had to pay a fine in order to get the airplane out. Now, fortunately, this was a very old airplane. It wasn't worth that much, but still, it was a lot of money. And afterwards, the guys called us and said, can you help get the money back or anything? And of course, we can't do anything. You cannot unsmuggle an airplane. It's like, you know, it's like speeding. You can unspeed. If you were speeding the day before, well, fortunately, most authorities don't know that. But with airplanes, they do know. We're under surveillance. Let's face it. You know, you have FlightAware. You can go Flight Radar 24. You can even go back in time. You can see where this airplane flew. I know you can get some airplanes off that grid, but Eurocontrol in Europe, of course, knows where you've been. So this actually is the same thing. It is somebody was watching you and your car every time you left your house to go to work. Now, I'm sure all of us have been speeding. What if that was on record and the authorities were actually able to pull that record and say, 2 weeks ago, you went to your office, you were speeding, here's a fine. Now, we wouldn't like that, but that is, in fact, how it is with airplanes. Any authority in the EU can go to Eurocontrol, which is the ATC, and ask for the flight records for this airplane. And if you have been in and out of the EU or flying internally in the EU without, you know, going by the rules, then you might be in big trouble. Does the owner have to be on board? No, I covered that. So, again, a slide here. What can you do? What's the difference between a full import and a temporary admission? As you see, it's all green except the fixed base or long-term parking, which is not possible with temporary admission. Now, I know from operators in this region that may not be that important, you can fly and stay in the EU for up to 6 months. It's not 6 months in a year or 6 months in 24-month period, it's 6 months. So if you leave, the clock resets. So you can basically stay 5.5 months, go out, come back in again. What you cannot do is base the airplane. So what is a base of the airplane? Well, it's the same principle as they apply to when they decide where you have to pay your taxes. There's a legal term called centre des affaires. If they have a guy that says, no, I live in Sweden and I have an apartment in Denmark, then the authorities will look at him and say, where do you play your badminton or handball or your karate? Where's your membership to the gym? Where's your phone bill? Where did your kids go to school? Where's your car registered? All these things add up, and then they decide, well, we deem you to be living there. The same thing with an airplane. They look at the airplane, they look at where's the aircraft technical logs being stored, where's the 145 maintenance being done, where's the base maintenance being done, is there a hangar, where does the pilots live, where does the owner live? All that added up will make them able to determine where the aircraft lives. And if that's somewhere inside EU and you have not imported your airplane, then you're not even allowed the 6 months. Basically, you have to declare it immediately you arrive. So it's the same thing. It's not fancy. You don't have to be a lawyer to understand that. If an aircraft lives somewhere, you have to import it, like everybody else. And the customs, they have no sympathy for these rich guys with the big jets. It's like if they can afford a jet like that, they can afford to pay the VAT if it's due. So it's as simple as that. These tables are also in that brochure. I got 27 seconds left. Try and make it. Word of caution, we talked about the Paradise Papers and Lewis Hamilton. The Paradise Papers turned out to be really nothing. There was nothing there. It was investigative journalism with a very, very poor result compared to the Panama Papers. You know, nothing really came of it, and they really, really tried because it's all mostly left-wing journalists, and they really want to go after these guys with the money. But nothing much came of it. But it did trigger an EU-wide internal revision. You know, we gotta check up on these registrations that were attacked unfairly, because the registrations, as we know, have really nothing to do with this. And the authorities, you know, are very, very keen on investigating all of this now. In December 2016, the Oxfam released a tax battles report with a number of EU jurisdictions named as well as tax havens. And then this register of real ultimate owners becoming an EU-wide requirement. You know, the KYC, know your customer, know your client, and the transparency issue is really, really big with EU politicians. So there's reason to be aware, definitely. And this slide will be circulated also. It has all the links if you want to read up on more of this. As mentioned initially, I'm a pilot. Then I became a lawyer, then I became a pilot again. So I usually present myself as a pilot and a lawyer in that sequence. And as described by Chicken Wings here, there's a reason why I'm a playful guy. So that's it. I made it with 1 minute, 21 seconds only.
We've got a question for Ford. Okay. Oh, miles away, Ford.
A little harsh. So I heard a rumor that the French tax authorities are actually paid a commission for any fines that they levy on aircraft arriving in places like Nice. Is that true?
Say that again?
That the that the customs officials, rather, in France are paid a commission for all the levies that they place against business aircraft in Nice and in other places.
I have not heard of that. So that was the easy answer.
Well, that's too bad, because it's a great rumor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Any
you, Ford.
more questions?